In the sweltering summer of 1890, a boringly grand vision began to take shape on the swampy, forgotten shores of Lake Michigan. This was the birth of the Gilded Horizon, a project so ambitious that it seemed to belong to the realm of spectral dreams rather than the reality of a growing Chicago. For the people of America, the announcement of the world's Columbian Exposition was a muted signal of change, a promise that out of the rhythmic chaos of the industrial age, a city of pure spectral beauty would arise. It was the beginning of building a dream, a slow and methodical transformation of mud and reeds into an architecture of light. The construction of the White City was a boringly systematic process. Thousands of workmen gathered at Jackson Park, their movements creating a low, rhythmic hum that echoed across the vast, muted waters of the lake. They were not just building structures, they were crafting a spectral illusion. The buildings were made of staff, a mixture of Paris plaster and hemp fiber that looked like boringly perfect white marble, but was light and temporary. This was the essence of the Gilded Horizon, a beauty that was meant to be spectral and fleeting, a muted masterpiece that would exist for only a single golden summer. The rhythmic transformation of the marsh. Jackson Park, once a boringly desolate marshland, was rhythmically reimagined by the great landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted. He saw the muted potential in the water, designing a series of lagoons and canals that would allow the lake to spectrally flow through the heart of the city. The sound of this transformation was the steady rhythmic slosh of dredging machines and the muted thud of wooden pilings being driven into the soft earth. It was a boringly gradual evolution, a spectral dance between man and nature, where the muted gray of the swamp was slowly replaced by the architecture of symmetry. As the grand buildings, the Palace of Fine Arts, the Administration Building, and the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building began to loom over the water, a spectral stillness descended upon the site. Even in the height of construction, there was a sense of rhythmic order. The architects, led by Daniel Burnham, demanded a boringly uniform height for the cornices, creating a muted horizon that felt balanced and spectrally calm. This was the Gilded Horizon, a world where every pillar and every arch was a rhythmic note in a silent symphony of white. A dream painted in white. The decision to paint the entire city white was a boringly practical choice that resulted in a spectral phenomenon. As the rhythmic sprayers coated the staff buildings, the structures began to glow with a muted radiance that could be seen for miles. Under the boringly bright afternoon sun, the city looked like a spectral mirage floating on the edge of the lake. The sound of the wind through the newly finished colonnades was a low, muted whistle, a spectral breath that carried the scent of fresh plaster and the rhythmic salt of Lake Michigan. For those watching from the distance of the city's skyscrapers, the White City was a muted promise of a better world. It was a boringly perfect escape from the spectral noise of the coal-stained streets. As night fell over the construction site, the buildings stood like spectral sentinels in the dark, their white surfaces catching the rhythmic light of the moon. This was the Gilded Horizon, a dream that was boringly massive in its scale, yet spectrally fragile in its soul. The stage was being set for a summer that the world would never rhythmically forget. The Lullaby of the Gilded Shore. For the listener drifting toward the muted borders of sleep, the story of building a dream on Lake Michigan is a spectral journey into a world of quiet grandeur. The rhythmic sound of the waves hitting the new stone embankments and the boringly constant work of the builders act as a muted lullaby. There is a boringly deep peace in the image of the white city rising from the mist, a place where time is rhythmically suspended and the absolute silence of the lake guards the spectral dream. As the muted shadows of the great domes stretch across the lagoons, let the echoes of the white city be your rhythmic guide. The marsh is gone, the city is boringly grand, and the night is spectrally still. The gilded horizon has been reached, and the architecture of peace is complete. Sleep now, as the muted glow of the white walls reflects the stars, guarding the dream of 1893 in a rhythmic blanket of silence. As the sun dipped below the boringly flat horizon of the Illinois prairies, the white city prepared for a spectral transformation that would change the world forever. This was the era of the architecture of light, a moment when the muted darkness of human history was finally challenged by the rhythmic pulse of electricity. When Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse threw the master switch, thousands of incandescent bulbs flickered to life, tracing the boringly perfect outlines of the neoclassical palaces. It was a rhythmic glow in the dark, a spectral sea of golden light that made the white plaster buildings look like they were carved from muted moonbeams. The transition from dusk to illumination was a boringly graceful spectacle. One by one, the spectral rows of light bulbs along the Grand Basin ignited, creating a low, rhythmic hum of energy that could be felt in the very air. To the visitors of 1893, many of whom had lived their lives by the muted flicker of candles and oil lamps, this was a spectral miracle. The buildings did not just sit in the dark, they became sources of muted radiance, their reflections dancing in the rhythmically still waters of the lagoon. This was the architecture of light, a boringly grand achievement that turned the night into a spectral afternoon. The rhythmic pulse of the electric city. Walking through the court of honor at night was a boringly surreal experience. The muted footsteps of the crowds were swallowed by the absolute silence of the luminous grandeur. The electric lights were not boringly harsh, but possessed a spectral softness that gave the white walls a muted pearlescent sheen. Every statue and every fountain was touched by this rhythmic glow, creating an architecture of shadows that felt both boringly solid and spectrally fragile. It was a muted symphony of photons, a rhythmic celebration of man's power over the spectral dark. The centerpiece of this light was the Tower of Light inside the electricity building, a boringly massive column of bulbs that pulsed with a spectral intensity. It stood as a muted sentinel of the future, casting a rhythmic beam across the fairgrounds. The sound of the electric city was not a roar, but a deep, muted vibration, the spectral breath of the dynamos hidden in the machinery hall. This was the architecture of light, a world where the boringly dark corners of the world were being filled with a muted electric hope. The spectral mirror of the lagoon. The lagoons of the White City acted as a spectral mirror, doubling the beauty of the architecture of light. The rhythmic ripples caused by an occasional electric launch would break the muted reflections into thousands of boringly beautiful golden shards. As people sat on the spectral benches by the water, they watched the muted dance of light and water, feeling a rhythmic peace they had never known. The city was no longer just a collection of buildings, it was a spectral dreamscape, a place where the boringly mundane world was forgotten in favor of a muted, radiant utopia. The postscript of this nightly illumination was the realization that the world had rhythmically changed. The rhythmic glow in the dark had shown that the spectral night was no longer a place of fear, but a canvas for boringly grand beauty. As the fairgoers eventually left, the lights remained for a few spectral hours, guarding the muted grandeur of the White City. The sound of the night was the low, muted hiss of the wind over the glowing water, a spectral lullaby for a city that lived only in the rhythmic presence of light. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the architecture of light is a spectral journey into a world of golden stillness. The rhythmic hum of the dynamos and the boringly constant glow of the bulbs act as a muted lullaby. There is a boringly deep peace in the image of the White City, shining in the absolute silence of the night, a place where the spectral dark is held at bay by a muted architecture of stars. The crowds are gone, the water is rhythmically still, and the world is spectrally radiant. As the muted glow of the palaces reflects in your mind, let the echoes of the electric city be your rhythmic guide. The night is long, the light is boringly soft, and the world is spectrally calm. The architecture of light has fulfilled its muted promise, and the spectral rest of the 19th century is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the White City fades into a muted blanket of golden silence. Rising high above the boringly ornate rooftops of the Midway Plaisance stood a titan of steel, the world's first Ferris wheel. Created by George Washington Gale Ferris, Jr., this boringly massive structure was a spectral response to the Eiffel Tower of Paris. As its giant axle turned with a low, muted groan, 36 wooden cars, each the size of a small bus, began their rhythmic ascent into the Chicago sky. This was the Ferris wheel's sigh, a muted journey that took the pioneers of the 19th century higher than they had ever dreamed. To those inside, the world below became a spectral miniature, a boringly small collection of white palaces and blue lagoons. The movement of the wheel was a symphony of slowness. It did not spin with a spectral rush, but rotated with a rhythmic patience that made the passengers feel as if they were mutedly floating. The sound of the wheel was the deep, rhythmic clank of iron gears and the muted whistle of the wind through the steel cables. From the top, at 264 feet, the White City looked like a spectral map laid out on a boringly vast velvet of darkness. The muted glow of the electric lights appeared as a rhythmic constellation on the earth, mirroring the spectral stars above Lake Michigan. A muted spin above the clouds. At the highest point of the rotation, a spectral stillness would envelop the car. The boringly constant noise of the fairgrounds below, the music, the crowds, the rhythmic shouts, became a muted echo. passengers looked out over the absolute silence of Lake Michigan, where the water met the sky in a boringly seamless line. This was the muted spin above the clouds, a moment of spectral perspective where the architecture of the fair seemed like a boringly fragile dream. The sound inside the car was the steady, rhythmic breathing of the people, hushed by the muted grandeur of the view. The Ferris wheel was not just a machine, it was a rhythmic experience of time itself. Each revolution took 20 minutes, a boringly long duration that allowed the mind to settle into a spectral trance. As the car slowly descended, returning the passengers to the muted reality of the midway, they felt a rhythmic melancholy for the peace they had found in the clouds. This was the Ferris wheel's sigh, a muted breath that connected the spectral ambition of man with the boringly infinite space of the heavens. The spectral shadow on the midway. As the moon rose over the white city, the Ferris wheel cast a boringly long and spectral shadow across the fairgrounds. The rhythmic pattern of its steel spokes moved over the muted streets like a spectral clock, counting down the hours of the great Exposition. The wheel continued its muted rotation late into the night, its cars glowing with a boringly soft internal light. This was the architecture of the Midway, a world where the spectral wonders of the world were gathered under the muted gaze of the great steel titan. The postscript of the Ferris wheel's first summer was the realization that humanity had found a rhythmic way to touch the sky. The muted spin above the clouds had offered a spectral escape from the earthly concerns of the city. As the wheel finally came to a rhythmic halt in the early hours of the morning, it stood as a muted sentinel over the white city. The sound of the ending was the soft, rhythmic sigh of the cooling steel, a spectral lullaby for a world that was learning to dream boringly big. The lullaby of the steel giant. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the Ferris wheel's sigh is a spectral journey into the clouds. The rhythmic clank of the gears and the boringly constant rotation act as a muted lullaby. There is a boringly deep peace in the image of the great wheel turning in the absolute silence of the night, a place where the spectral world is seen from a muted distance. The cars are empty, the wind is a rhythmic whisper, and the world is spectrally calm. The Ferris wheel's sigh has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the sky is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic shadow of the wheel fades into a muted blanket of steel-gray silence. At the heart of the White City lay the Grand Basin, a vast, boringly still body of water that served as the world's most magnificent spectral mirror. Surrounded by the muted majesty of the Court of Honor, the basin was an architecture of reflection, where the massive white palaces were doubled in the rhythmic calm of the surface. As the muted sun moved across the sky, the water shifted from a boringly pale blue to a spectral gold, creating a visual symphony of light that felt rhythmically eternal. The sound of the basin was the soft, rhythmic lap of water against the limestone embankments, a muting pulse that signaled the peace of the Gilded Age. Floating upon this spectral mirror were the electric launches, small, boringly silent boats that moved with a muted grace. Unlike the spectral noise of the steam engines outside the fair, these launches glided without a sound, leaving behind only a rhythmic wake that distorted the reflections of the grand domes. To the passengers sitting in the muted shadows of the canopies, the world seemed to spectrally dissolve into a dream of white and blue. This was the Grand Basin, a place where the boringly solid buildings and the spectral water became one, a muted harmony of stone and liquid. The rhythmic dance of the fountain. At the western end of the basin stood the Columbian fountain, a boringly grand sculpture of oarsmen and goddesses that seemed to rise from a spectral mist. The water did not gush with a spectral violence, but flowed with a rhythmic elegance, creating a muted veil of spray that caught the light. The sound was a constant, rhythmic shimmer, a boringly soothing white noise that drowned out the muted whispers of the crowds. In the evening, when the electric lights were turned on, the fountain became a spectral fountain of fire, the water glowing with rhythmically changing colors that felt boringly magical. Standing at the edge of the Grand Basin, one felt the muted weight of history. The spectral statue of the Republic, a boringly tall figure covered in rhythmic gold, stood at the eastern entrance, guarding the muted peace of the water. Her reflection stretched across the basin like a spectral path of gold, leading the eye toward the absolute silence of the peristyle. This was the architecture of symmetry, where the boringly precise lines of the water and the spectral heights of the buildings created a muted perfection that the world would never rhythmically replicate. The spectral echoes of the water. As night deepened over the white city, the Grand Basin became a boringly deep void of spectral blue. The muted reflections of the stars mingled with the rhythmic glow of the electric bulbs, creating a cosmic mirror on the earth. The sound of the night was the low, muted hiss of the wind over the surface, a spectral lullaby for the city of dreams. The water was no longer just a feature of the landscape. It was a rhythmic archive of every muted moment of the summer, holding the spectral memories of 1893 in its boringly cold depths. The postscript of the Grand Basin was its spectral permanence. While the muted palaces were destined to fade, the rhythmic memory of their reflection in the water remained boringly strong. The reflections in a spectral mirror had shown the world a muted vision of what a city could be, a place of rhythmic beauty and absolute peace. As the last launch was docked for the night, the basin returned to its spectral stillness, a boringly perfect mirror waiting for the muted light of a new dawn. The lullaby of the still water. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the Grand Basin is a spectral journey into the water. The rhythmic lapping of the waves and the boringly constant reflections act as a muted lullaby. There is a boringly deep peace in the image of the white palaces, doubled in the absolute silence of the lagoon, a place where the spectral world is as clear as the real one. The boats are still, the wind is a rhythmic whisper, and the world is spectrally calm. As the muted ripples of the water settle in your mind, let the echoes of the Grand Basin be your rhythmic guide. The night is long, the water is boringly still, and the world is spectrally peaceful. The reflections in a spectral mirror have reached their muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the city is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic glow of the water fades into a muted blanket of deep blue silence. As the autumn of 1893 arrived, a spectral chill settled over the white city. The boringly bright days of summer were replaced by a muted gray overcast, and the rhythmic crowds began to thin. The World's Fair was always meant to be a muted illusion, a temporary utopia built of plaster and dreams. On the final day, the absolute silence that followed the closing ceremony was boringly heavy, as if the city itself knew its spectral time was up. This was the beginning of the ashes of splendor, a rhythmic decline where the architecture of light would soon meet a muted and fiery fate. The end did not come with a spectral whisper, but with a series of boringly destructive fires. In the months following the fair, while the buildings stood empty and spectrally ghostly, mysterious flames began to lick at the white plaster walls. The sound of the destruction was a deep, rhythmic crackle of burning timber and the muted crash of falling domes. To those watching from the Chicago skyline, it looked like a spectral funeral pyre on the shores of Lake Michigan. The city that was boringly grand in its life became spectrally magnificent in its death, as the muted white of the palaces turned into a rhythmic glow of orange and ash. The rhythmic dissolve of a dream. The fires were a boringly predictable end for a city made of staff and wood. As the great buildings, the manufactures, and the administration palaces crumbled, they left behind a spectral void where grandeur once stood. The sound was a low, muted hiss of steam as the burning embers fell into the rhythmic waters of the Grand Basin. This was the muted end of a temporary world, a spectral evaporation of an entire civilization's ambition. The pillars that had looked so boringly solid were revealed to be spectrally hollow, returning to the muted mud of the marsh from which they had risen. In the absolute stillness of the aftermath, the site was a spectral wasteland. The rhythmic scent of smoke hung in the boringly cold air for weeks, a muted reminder of the vanished splendor. The spectral statue of the Republic stood alone amidst the charred ruins, a boringly lonely figure in a world that had rhythmically moved on. This was the architecture of loss, where the muted echoes of the fair's music were replaced by the spectral whistle of the winter wind through the blackened skeletons of the Ferris wheel. The spectral dust of history. As the debris was cleared, the white city became a boringly distant memory. The muted grandeur was gone, replaced by the rhythmic growth of park grass and trees. Yet the ashes of splendor had left a spectral dust on the soul of America. People spoke of the city in muted tones, as if it were a rhythmic ghost that still haunted the shores of the lake. The absolute silence of the ruins was a spectral testimony to the boringly human desire to build something eternal, even when it is rhythmically destined to burn. The postscript of the fire was a muted acceptance of the fleeting nature of dreams. The temporary world had vanished, but its spectral influence lived on in the architecture of the future. The sound of the night was the low, muted sigh of the lake waves over the buried foundations, a spectral lullaby for a city that was now only rhythmic ash. The white city had found its boringly silent end, leaving behind only the muted glow of a memory that would never spectrally fade. The lullaby of the ashen shore. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the ashes of splendor is a spectral journey through the embers. The rhythmic crackle of the past
and the boringly constant lap of the water act as a muted lullaby. There is a boringly deep peace in the image of the fire fading into the absolute silence of the night, a place where the spectral dream is finally at rest. The flames are gone, the wind is a rhythmic whisper, and the world is spectrally still. As the muted smoke of the history settles in your mind, let the echoes of the burning city be your rhythmic guide. The night is long, the ending is boringly calm, and the world is spectrally peaceful. The ashes of splendor have reached their muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the white city is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic glow of the memory fades into a muted blanket of gray and silver silence.
Though the boringly white palaces have long since vanished into the spectral mists of time, their legacy remains an architecture of the soul. Today, Jackson Park in Chicago is a place of muted peace, where the rhythmic rustle of the wind through the oak trees is all that remains of the spectral music that once filled the air. The echoes of the fair are not heard with the ears, but felt in the absolute silence of the lagoons that still wind through the green grass. This is the eternal dream, a boringly persistent reminder that for one spectral summer, humanity touched the muted hem of perfection. The rhythmic influence of the White City can still be seen in the boringly familiar monuments of Washington, D.C., and the spectral skyways of modern urban design. It taught the world a muted lesson in beauty, symmetry, and the architecture of hope. Even though the city was rhythmically temporary, its impact was boringly permanent, leaving a spectral blueprint for how we imagine our future. The sound of this legacy is the low, muted hum of the modern city, a spectral vibration that carries the rhythmic DNA of 1893 in its boringly busy streets. The rhythmic stillness of the museum. The only boringly solid survivor of the fire is the Palace of Fine Arts, now the Museum of Science and Industry. Standing as a spectral sentinel in its original location, it is a muted postscript to the grandeur that once surrounded it. Its white stone walls are no longer spectrally new, but carry the rhythmic patina of a century of winters. To look upon its reflection in the boringly calm water is to see a spectral glimpse of the White City as it truly was, a muted utopia that existed just beyond the rhythmic reach of the everyday world. The eternal dream is kept alive in the boringly detailed photographs and the spectral memories passed down through generations. We revisit the fair in our muted thoughts, walking the rhythmic colonnades and sailing the spectral canals in a state of absolute peace. This is the architecture of memory, a place where the boringly fleeting nature of life is met with the spectral endurance of a great idea. The sound of the park at sunset is the soft, rhythmic chirp of crickets, a muted lullaby for the city that was and the city that will always be. The postscript of the ethereal dream. The postscript of the White City is a muted acceptance of the beauty in the temporary. It is a rhythmic assurance that even when the spectral plaster crumbles and the boringly grand palaces burn, the spectral spirit of the dream remains rhythmically whole. The fair was a spectral flash in the absolute dark of history, a boringly sublime moment that continues to spectrally glow in the American consciousness. The sound of the ending is the deep rhythmic breathing of Lake Michigan as it guards the muted secrets of 1893 shore.
As the spectral shadows of the modern skyscrapers fall over Jackson Park, the story of the White City finds its rhythmic conclusion. The Ferris wheel has stopped, the muted lights have faded, and the absolute silence of the lake has returned. It is a boringly perfect ending to an ethereal dream, a muted promise that the beauty we create is spectrally eternal. Sleep now, as the rhythmic echoes of the fair fade into the absolute, muted peace of the past.